Okay, hello, my friends. Here are the three big stories for today. I'm not going to talk about this one, so this would be a fourth, but I'm not going to really talk about it except for to say this. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kaliba's resignation has been long anticipated. Again, everything I've detected yesterday and today, it's not scandal, it's just a reshuffle. Um, and so they're going through this process in the Verkhonovna right now, like removing these ministers, and they're removing about half of them and replacing them. So it's a big reshuffle. He may be eyeing the position of ambassador, with the U.S. mentioned as one of the options. That may or may not be the case. There was other news that he might be looking at how to integrate Ukraine into NATO. Either way, he'll be useful in some capacity, but we just don't know exactly what he's going to be doing. And again, I talked about this yesterday in my five big stories. Okay, so let's go on to the actual stories for today. President Zalinsky will attend the Ramstein meeting in Germany tomorrow. He plans to appeal to Western partners for continued weapons supplies, including long-range missiles and additional air defense systems. Now, if that sounds like a broken record, there's kind of a reason that you keep hearing that same story. Now, this I found tragic. Zelensky told NBC News, we're going to talk about part of his interview here in just a moment. He told NBC News that he did not inform Biden about the Kursk operation due to concerns over potential information leak. Wow. Like, okay, that shouldn't be happening. According to him, by 2023, everyone knew about Ukraine's counteroffensive plans, allowing Russians to prepare accordingly, and that 2023 counteroffensive was absolutely disastrous. Lack of long-range weapons forced us, he says in this interview, he's talking to NBC, lack of long-range weapons forced us to look for alternatives, and that's how the operation in Kursk region started. So it was because they were starved from the weapons that they're supposed to have had that were given by Congress after a delay of 6 months that shouldn't have taken place there, and now it's being delayed in actually getting there, and that's what caused them to have to do what they did in Kursk in order to shift the momentum. Biden continues withholding aid to Ukraine. Ukraine has not yet received the military aid provided by the decision of the U.S. Congress, or at least not all of it. Here, this is part of the Zalinsky interview, and so you're seeing the pieces here of the most important things that he said. We've agreed on weapons on paper, but in reality, they're not in Ukraine, or at least not most of them, or not enough of them. Some are going to be coming later this year, some in 2025, and so it takes time for it to get there, and in the meantime, they still have to fight. Okay, he said we have a victory plan according to which Ukraine can win, and Kursk is part of that plan. Okay, um, so Kursk kind of grew up organically as they were trying to figure out how to get better leverage on the Russians. We had signals that the Russians wanted to create a buffer zone near Sumy and Chernihiv regions. Okay, and so, yeah, the buffer zone, that's a good idea. What the Russians just did, let's do that to them. The operation in Kursk will last as long as we need it for victory. The Russians withdrew, and I didn't know this number, the Russians withdrew 60,000 troops to Kursk. Okay, so that is a very impressive figure, and that would explain why some of the momentum has stopped in the Kursk region, because the Russians are, and they didn't go right to them. They started building defense lines behind where, or ahead of where the Ukrainians would have been going. Earlier, the ratio of our weapons to Russian weapons was 1 to 12. After the Kursk operation, it became 1 to 3. I'm not exactly sure what he's saying here with the how Kursk became a weapons ratio of 1 to 3, but weapons ratio of 1 to 12, that's a pretty tough place to be, right? Putin is pulling all his forces into the Donetsk direction because this is their main goal. So unfortunately, what Putin did not do was take these troops that went to Kursk. He didn't take them from Donetsk. He just piled them in Donetsk, and he's really trying to take Покrovsk. And in my video about that with Greg Terry, you'll understand why. Putin is pulling all his forces to the Donetsk direction because this is their main goal. We have much less troops. Our partners should help us with weapons and technologies. But if the weapons do not arrive as promised, we begin to think about what to do without them, right? And that's really where the Ukrainians are. They have to come up with creative alternatives because the Russians aren't stopping. Meanwhile, big story number two, Putin is having his say about things, and he's talking about the losses suffered by the Ukrainian armed forces and suggested that if this continues, Kyiv might end up creating groups similar to Hitler Youth. Okay, it's still pushing that same narrative of that they're Nazis and that sort of thing. Now, in contrast, not this isn't what Putin's talking about, but the UK, US, and France, as well as public research on Russian losses, range somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 killed and wounded. The Ukrainian figure is north of 600,000. Maybe they know something that we don't know. Maybe they're inflating. I can't tell. But I'm using that as a kind of a barometer for what's going on. But it's most likely at the high end of this spectrum of the 500,000. It's probably somewhere closer to this 500,000 figure. Okay. Ukrainian losses are estimated at 170 to 190 killed and wounded. And so this makes some sense because they've been in the defensive war for most of this. So the Russians just sending their troops into the wood chipper, that would be consistent with this 500,000 as opposed to less than 200,000. It's still very bad all the way around, but yeah, okay. Big story number 3. So yesterday and then today in my last video, I was talking about the amazing thing that's just happened with the exposure of Russian efforts to influence through social media. And they're doing it through social media influencers rather than just their own trolls. And that's the shift. That's the change here. And so one of the focal points here is RT spending a shell corporation who's purchasing influencers or amplifying influencers like through tenant media. Okay, and so we're going to talk about that to some degree here. When you dismiss Russian disinformation as irrelevant or inconsequential, remember thousands of Ukrainians died last year because Russian disinformation enveloped the U.S. Republican Party to the point that they blocked Ukraine's funding for 6 months, a rug pull during the counteroffensive, a tragedy that allowed Russians to make huge gains that are still ongoing. Yeah, what happened last year, terrible, absolutely terrible, right? Nobody's like, I'm a Republican, I'm not defending that. That's bad. That should never have happened. Russians spend billions a year on disinformation to warp naive American minds because it works. Okay, but it's not just in America. See, that's the real trick. Now, what they were doing was really interesting because they were paying social media, or they were amplifying social media influencers rather than just doing their own trolling, which was a clever innovation. But they're not just doing it here, they're doing it in Europe as well. This is from Euromaidan Press. The FBI obtained documents that reveal Russia's extensive disinformation campaign aimed at winning over Europeans' hearts and minds, which entails manipulating UK, Italian, French, and German officials, influencers, and journalists. And that comes from an article in Politico. We're going to look at the Euromaidan Press version of this, which is kind of a condensed version of this. The FBI obtained documents reveal Russia's extensive disinformation campaign aimed at winning over the European heart and minds. The documents obtained by the FBI reveal that Russia is conducting psychological warfare in Europe with the goal being to sow division, discredit the United States, and undermine support for Ukraine. Let's get rid of this guy. The indictments shed light on far-reaching Russian disinformation campaign aimed not only at the United States, but also several European countries. So, what happened here? One memo from Russia's social design agency described a plan to target people through real posts and comments on social media to circumvent social media companies' bot filters. So they're getting clever. They're learning how to do something different, because just filtering through bots wasn't enough. If they can amplify narratives that are similar enough to theirs, they can still have the effect. The Russian document says the goal of the campaign is to evoke in the audience rationale such as, why do we need to help Ukraine? Like, you see that in social media on Twitter, or Americans are such scumbags. And again, this is for a European audience. Now, Germany and France are crucial targets. The Russian PSYOPs team identified Germany as particularly vulnerable as a target for Russian influence. Quote, the Germans are more dependent than the French, unquote, and they're probably referring to economic dependence on Russian gas and exports. First and foremost, we needed to discredit the USA, Great Britain, and NATO, and secondly, convince the Germans to oppose the inefficient policies of sanctions. So they're doing the same thing, and they're using real social media influencers to do it. So its objective is to escalate internal tensions in order to promote the interests of the Russian Federation, as well as to influence real life conflicts and artificially create conflict situations through fake articles, influencers, as well as targeted posts and comments on social media. Now, why wouldn't they use influencers, right? Companies pay influencers to wear their attire or just talk about their products or that sort of thing. The Russians are just taking that same model and applying it to geopolitics, spreading additional false narratives, fake videos, documents, telephone conversations, recordings, comments on social media, and fake and real quotes from influencers. I saw this and I thought this was insightful. I think of something that Phillips O'Brien has observed to me in a podcast. The Russians have gained far more geopolitical leverage out of the millions that they've spent on information warfare than the billions they've spent on the military. Wow, how about that? But of course, remember, Putin never lies. And here's the proof. Here he is saying that we always tell the truth. It's probably the best weapon against lies and propaganda soaked with these lies, except that he's not really telling the truth. And while we used to think that it was that there was some guy somewhere squirreled away in St. Petersburg, just that was the source of the problem. The problem is probably actually our own actual authentic influencers who are peddling those same lies. But there's really no way to determine whether they're a verified Russian asset or what have you. And for my money, I think there's some that might be on the take, and then there are others that are just peddling their thing, and the Russians are amplifying that narrative, and that's what's causing what's going on here. But correct me if I'm wrong. Put it in the comments below. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.